you can't go back on the page either, right? Like just in life, once you make the decision, you can't rewind time. You've made the decision. Someone is good at what they do, they become complacent, and a lot of the times it's because they think they're just better than everyone else. A lot of the times, like these higher levels of players have improved at what they did, and then when they try to go back and improve a skill that they need to improve on, but they're afraid of looking bad, I guess, in front of people or like to themselves. They just don't want to do it because they don't have that like you said, the beginner's mindset of like the default of failure.
The following is a conversation with LegitKorea, a challenger Ahri player in League of Legends in 4 separate seasons, being the first player in North America to reach challenger in season 12, and recently, over the last year and a half, a very fast improving Osu player as well. More than anything, he's a deep thinker when it comes to improvement, and I was delighted to have this conversation with him. This is the honmi podcast. To support it, you can subscribe on YouTube or support me directly using the Patreon link in the description. And now for my conversation with LegitKorea. Do you believe life is a game?
Ooh. Do I believe life is a game? Do I see it as a game? Yes. Do I believe life is a game? I don't know. I never really thought of it that way, actually. But like the way I see life is like kind of like a video game-esque, right? Where you have different skill levels and you just can't see them, right? You see them through your product or your work. But yeah, truly seeing it as a video game, not so much, but I do see aspects of video games in life.
Things like skill acquisition.
Yeah. Kind of like also when I like started Osu as well, you know, people would always talk about stamina and things like that, and I would run out of stamina pretty quickly. So I was thinking like, well, in life there's actually like a bar, right, where your stamina, you have a certain limit of stamina, right? But you just can't see it.
Invisible UI.
Exactly. You just can't see it, right? So that's just kind of how I see things in life as well. It's like there's limits to things that you can do. You just can't see what your resource bars are or anything like that, right? You just get a feel for it.
Do you conceptualize skills in terms of like you have skill points that you're able to use, or is that going too far the rabbit hole of life being a game?
I think that's a little too far in the rabbit hole because everyone improves at a different rate as well. Seeing it that way doesn't, I mean, I guess if you were to do it per person, I guess you could say there are skill points. But just because of like how people improve differently, it's like I don't really think it makes too much sense because in a video game you all start at the same place, right?
Right.
But in life it's not fair.
What comes to mind when I say the word talent?
I believe that there's talent. Are you asking like what I think of the word of talent?
Yeah, sort of what comes to mind, and I guess what do you see as the relationship between talent and say luck or genetics? Do you think they all are sort of under the same umbrella?
I think some of them are like they do overlap in some sense where you can't really independently someone like say someone has talent, right? Because that's just like impossible to do because like the product that we provide is the show of like our hard work, talent, genetics, etc. It's just a whole bunch of different factors, right? But yeah, in terms of talent, it's its own thing, and I don't think talent really matters in terms of like, let's say in the sense of if you wanted to become good at what you do, because that just requires a lot of hard work. I think talent is not really important until you get to the very best of doing what you do.
Do you consider being exposed to an activity at an early age or an activity being nurtured for you at a young age? Do you consider that to be luck?
Yes.
Okay.
Because like you're not choosing to do that, right? That's like your parents like deciding for you.
Right. But even let's say you stumble across the technique, maybe when you were just experimenting with a new game or new activity, and you happen to, the natural instinct of technique that you tried happened to be the one that is the most optimized, basically. Do you consider that to be luck as well?
I think that would fall under the category of luck, right?
Is there a way that that can be mitigated? Or I guess a better way to ask this question is like, what role does information and information seeking have in the process of improvement? Like, in your opinion, what is the ideal balance between seeking like information, tips, and tricks on how to improve versus actual practice, which that practice also sort of includes experimenting on your own to try figuring out how to improve without seeking any information or tips. So, what is the sort of ideal balance between seeking information and actual practice to figure things out on your own?
So if I'm understanding what like you were specifically talking about, I think that in terms of improving and like practicing, if you want to do it, then you'll just be practicing it and just doing it. Seeking out information and things like that, that's like also the same case of like wanting to do it and things like that. It's like a different kind of practice, I would say.
Can you explain what you mean by wanting to do it?
Yeah, so if you have the drive to do something, so I guess like the motivation or like the want to pursue something, that's I guess what I mean by like wanting to pursue an activity or like getting better at an activity kind of thing.
You, from what I've noticed, seem to have this sort of drive to be exceptional at whatever it
Mhm.
is that you do. Do you feel like there's something in your life that sort of caused you to have that drive?
Yeah, this is actually kind of an interesting thing as I grew up because when I was younger, this is why I like believe that there's talent and that it doesn't matter until you get to the very top. Is because when I was young, I was actually really good at a lot of things, and I would just be able to inherently do a lot of things optimally. I would say, like I would be good at math class, or I would just be good at like sports, right? Basketball, things like that, and or piano even. Like I would play piano, and I would never practice, but I was like good enough. Sorry, I was good enough to be like at a statewide or nationwide level, which was like kind of insane. Just like the techniques that I used or like the way I was able to play was just like it just clicked. But the thing was that I never practiced. So as I grew older, um, I realized that like if I wanted to become good at the things that I wanted to do, I would have to practice. And so I ended up falling behind people because they would have the good fundamentals to keep practicing or like good um, systems in place or like let's say teachers to help them keep improving. But I took it all for granted. When I got to the point where it did matter, depending on like your fundamentals and how you practiced, that's when I realized like, oh, I kind of like wasted my time. So that's when I got into like kind of the depression phase of like, man, I'm kind of worthless, you know? And so that was when I was like around like 18 and 19 and I actually moved out by myself to a different city. I told my parents 2 weeks in advance, like, "Hey, I'm moving with my friends to like a different city.
Oh wow.
I'm gonna head out." It was basically the mentality of like I'm either gonna make something for my life or I'm going to kind of. It's a little brutal to say, but like just end it all. All right, so I decided to go for it, and so League of Legends has helped me realize that I have a lot of potential in terms of like I was really bad at League of Legends. That was like the only game that like or not only game. Video games are the things that I was never good at, but I just kept playing it because they were fun. And so after getting good at League of Legends, I hit Challenger, I hit rank one, playing Ahri, rank one in the leaderboard in NA, things like that. I realized that like I'm good enough to do things, but like I never put in the practice. But now that I have put in the practice for like League of Legends, if I put that into practice with other things, that it's like I can do the things that I want to do in life, no matter what it may be. So, kind of going off on a tangent here. What I wanted to say from the beginning was that like that basically made me realize that like I just need to do things, right, and just put into practice if I want to be good at it. Because anybody can be good at what they do if they put in the time. That's the baseline that I see it as. But then the people that like make it to the very, very top, like if you were to say, for example, like I guess in OSU terms, like Emrek,
Right.
if you were to see him, that's not just practice. That's just like he's inherently good at the game, right? Something with him clicked.
Yeah. And for context, Emmerich is the current number one player by like a complete landslide.
Yeah, it's like not even close. He's like absolutely ridiculous in what he does, and he's even improving beyond what he's already doing.
Yeah, he's already way ahead and he's still improving.
So yeah, there's just special cases like that, which like who knows if I could have been like that as well, like if I decided to pursue what I wanted to do when I was younger. But the biggest thing is like everyone can get to a baseline level if they put in the practice, but at the very highest levels, it really just depends on like your upbringing, who you are. If you're lucky, I guess you could say it's luck, things like that. But that's what gave me the motivation to keep trying, right? It was I'm ending it all or I'm going to become the best at what I do.
I see. So it sounds like when you were younger, you had this inherent ability to pick things up quickly. And I think I hear this sometimes referred to as gifted kid syndrome, basically, where you never needed to learn how to practice. And so at some point, you sort of get surpassed by your peers who may not be able to figure things out as quickly and intuitively as you, but because they had this sort of work ethic instilled into them at a younger age. Would you say that in the long run, hard work beats predisposition to picking things up quickly?
If you were to talk about the long run, like end game,
Yes.
no,
Oh, really?
because um, let's say, for example, someone with talent, like quote unquote talent, and someone that doesn't have talent work at the same rate, right? They work hard. The person that has the predisposition or like the inherent um, like talent, I guess,
Ability to pick things up quickly?
yeah, ability to pick things up quickly.
Okay. And that's basically what we mean when we say talent here?
Yes.
Okay.
That person will, I won't say in every case because, you know, I don't know every person, but in my mind, I do see it as like those people will be most of the time better off at the very highest levels of skill in whatever case.
I think maybe the question I'm really trying to ask is, the tortoise and the hare?
Yes.
Which one on paper should win in most situations? And obviously in the tortoise and the hare, the lesson that's given is even if you have talent and a natural predisposition to doing better than your peers, if you allow that to turn into complacency, then that will not do you any favors, obviously. Are there any other important mindsets that you should take into account, even if you did have this talent? What are some other important mindsets that you need to keep in mind to make sure that you are able to make the most use out of your talent?
I think for me, from a personal experience, like being humble is like a really important thing because if you get ahead of yourself, that's when complacency sets in, right? For a lot of people that I've seen as well, like within myself and a lot of other people, is that someone is good at what they do, they become complacent, and a lot of the times it's because they think they're just better than everyone else. So I would say like just being humble, even if you are good at the things you do, like when you first get into something, I think that that mindset is very important that a lot of people should definitely take into consideration.
When you say being humble, I think what comes to mind for me is if you sort of realize that you are picking something up very quickly and you know that you want to be very good at it, I think that realization should actually motivate you to practice even harder than everyone else around you. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've played Pokemon, but
I have.
in Pokemon, there's an item called Lucky Egg, where if you give that to your Pokemon, basically it gains experience faster. And
Okay.
I feel like that sort of concept is like if you're picking something up naturally, like it's like you realize that you have a lucky egg on you for that specific activity.
Uh,
And so like your practice is basically going to be more efficient in that sense.
yeah.
You'll be able to get basically more experience points given the same amount of practice as the average person who's doing that activity. So yeah, I think just sort of the reason I mentioned that is just to add on to what you said about being humble. I think convincing yourself that you're not special, even if you in fact are, more or less, obviously subjectively, but even if you do recognize that you're picking something up quickly, I think convincing yourself that you're not special will allow yourself to keep practicing and not let that complacency sort of set in.
I agree with that because like I think that it's okay to acknowledge that like you are different or that you pick things up easier than other people. But then like having that realization and being like saying that you're not special, convincing yourself that you're not special is a good thing to like help drive and motivate you to like just keep working as hard as, the hardest people work.
Okay, I have two questions that they're very related, so I'll ask them together, but they are still two separate questions. So the first is, what is the role of expectation in performance? And how would you say expectation and confidence relate to one another? And would you say there's a connection between the two?
Could you give me like an example of exactly what you mean by this?
I think this ties somewhat heavily to mindset, where if you expect to do very well versus if you expect to do very poorly, like
Mhm.
how much of a role do you feel like that has in your actual performance?
Ah, I see. Yeah, I think having a positive mindset and like expecting to do well is really important at a subconscious level. From the way I see it, because I don't really like venture too far off into like other forms of like mindset and things like that. But I'm sure you've heard of like manifesting destiny, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I think it ties into that where like people are so confident in what they do that they manifest destiny. And I think it is the same case of like you need to have a positive mindset to say that you're going to succeed no matter what, so that you manifest destiny. It basically is what they're saying. Right? Even if it doesn't work out, just believing that it is always going to work out will yield a better result than saying like this is going to be terrible or like I'm not going to do well. So, I think subconsciously it is really important to have a positive mindset for that expectation to perform well.
That reminds me a lot of when people say it's more related to self fulfilling prophecies, basically, but it really has to do with self identifying as something. And basically, the idea around identifying as something is that people will naturally act in ways that are in accordance with their identity. So if you identify as someone who is successful, then you will naturally do things that you believe successful people do. And inherently, that will result in you, you know, basically being someone who is successful. And then obviously the opposite is also true, where if you identify as someone who, for lack of a better term, is a failure, then you end up acting in ways that are in accordance with what you believe a failure would do. And that's sort of, at least in my understanding, where self-fulfilling prophecies sort of come to be.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's true. As like you just act in accordance to what you feel like you are, basically.
Right.
And it's a very subconscious thing, which is why you can actively choose to think about like what you identify as or like what your mindset should be, and you can like train that. But subconsciously, like if you're just gonna let whatever actions you do dictate how you're gonna live your life, you're not gonna have any control of your life.
I think another big component is your ability to commit to what you believe should work in theory is definitely different depending on your confidence levels. And even if you
Mhm.
have all the abilities at your disposal, let's say you definitely have the skills to, get whatever desired result, maybe win a match or something like that, but you don't have the confidence to commit to those skills that you have, it's sort of you end up diluting your maximum potential. And that obviously can cause a lot of problems when it comes to performance.
Agreed. Yeah, that's basically what it's like. I guess you could kind of technically like are we assuming that people watching this are going to be like gamers or just like for everyone?
I think gamers, but you can apply it to anyone.
Okay, so in a game where like let's say you're playing an MMO, it would be something like you reach your max potential. All right, like you have a certain amount of damage you can deal per second, but then you like self-inflict onto yourself like a debuff, like a negative 10% damage
Right.
output.
Right.
Right, that's kind of what it's like.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Talking first in the context of League and then again in a broader sense, when is it okay to take risks?
In League of Legends, like it depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? If there's a lot on the line, then you're more likely to not take as many risks. But if there's not much on the line and you're just looking to, let's say, improve, this is what's called like limit testing. Then you're more likely to just make plays, take more risks, so that you can get a bigger reward. So something like in League of Legends, like if you were to play solo queue, you probably would take more risks if you don't really care too much about your rank. Like if you don't really care about rank and you're looking to improve, you're probably just going to like play for fun, play to make more risky plays to get like more leads and things like that. However, more so in like LCS, which is like the professional gaming space, you'll tend to see a lot of these players will not make these like super risky plays because there's a lot on the line.
LCS is the World Championships.
LCS is the North American Pro League.
Okay, so professional players basically like actual tournaments, you know?
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. And so on the line is like there's money on the line, there's you as a player, your identity as a player on the line, the organization that you work for, things like that. So there's a lot more pressure in these kinds of scenarios. So you won't see too many crazy plays just like, I'm going to go for this crazy play because that's when you make those kinds of plays and you'll get made fun of on Reddit for doing something crazy, right? Which on the other hand, like vice versa, if you do something crazy, then you'll pop off on Reddit. But it's a very extreme case of like you would want to be more reserved in those kinds of situations. And in life, I would say the younger you are, the more risks you should take because the reward is so much greater than the setback, right? You're learning, you're figuring out who you are, you're figuring out the limitations of life and things like that. So you should be looking to explore and figuring out what the limits are to life and not be too scared. But when you're older, you kind of don't have that luxury to do so. I talked to a lot of people when I was working as well, like people with families. They would be like, yeah, I can't really start a business and like, just go out there and do it because I have a family to support. I need to be stable. I need to be grounded. And so when you're younger, you have so much more time to take those risks. When you're older, you don't really have that kind of like luxury if you have a family or you have things on the line that you need to take care of.
So it sounds like the more that's on the line, the more you have to lose, then the less okay it really is to take risks. Do you feel like there are some common fallacies, I guess, where people believe that they have a lot on the line when in fact they are actually in a pretty good situation to take risks? And what are those sort of misconceptions that you see some people make, even in just in the context of League, where people feel like they shouldn't take a risk when in fact it's probably the better idea?
Yeah, so I guess if we were to talk in like in the sense of League, people don't have much on the line when they play League for fun, but people get scared of like getting yelled at or like getting blamed for their mistake, right? So they play a lot more reserved. And in the same sense of like in life, I feel like people are too self-conscious a lot of the times if they don't want to take risks, which isn't necessarily true for everyone that's like, more reserved as a person.
It might be more common than you might think, even in the context of if you want to take a risk in the context of your life, any life decision, really. I think needing to consider what your parents will think, what your close friends and loved ones will think, definitely, I think, plays into a lot of people's decisions. And I've heard many accounts of how people sort of stagnate and are too afraid to change aspects of their life that are distressing for them or that they're not satisfied with, just sort of in fear of what other people will think of them.
Exactly.
Do you feel like those are valid reasons to stay away from taking risks, or do you feel like those are thoughts that, given the context, you should try to work through and allow yourself to take those risks anyway?
I think it's a valid reason in terms of like if you decide and like weigh the consequences to the reward. If you feel like the opinions of others is that important to you that it stops you from making the decisions that you want and you feel like that's valid, then that's perfectly fine. I don't think that's like a terrible thing. Like if you're happy with your decision, that's all that matters, right? But there could be more out there that you never realized, right? So understanding that the risk that you're taking could have those kinds of opportunities is like something that people don't consider as much, but they look at more of the negative part of, I guess, the equation, right? So the opinions of others, the negativity, all that, like more of the negative aspects of like the decisions that you make in life, rather than the positive or the risk to reward things.
Would you say that not taking a risk is a risk in and of itself?
I think not taking a risk is like I guess it really just depends on the situation itself, like the situation that you're in. But for the most part, I feel like if you're not taking a risk, you're just not making a decision. So then you're just kind of like going with the flow.
Oh, interesting.
You're not really deciding fate for yourself. You're just letting things happen.
So you mentioned that not choosing to do something differently and just going with the flow of things is basically what not taking a risk is. Would you define not taking a risk as not deliberately changing anything about your situation?
I think if you're wanting more in your life, let's say in life, your happiness is between -5 and 5, right? Something along those lines. And like if you're at a point where like you're not happy with your life, you're not content, and you're continuing to stay in the negatives or like a neutral zero, but you want more and you're not making those decisions to like improve or better your life, then yes.
I feel like there's some element of being able to look into the future of the natural trajectory of your current life and being able to assess it perhaps on that scale of -5 to 5 happiness. Because I feel like if you're not making any decisions, or
Mhm.
if you're allowing your life to stagnate, for lack of a better term, then in theory that number should stay around the same, that sort of happiness assessment of where your life is as a whole.
I think it really just comes down to like what you want in life, right? So if you don't do anything, I guess it could go down in a sense, right? Because like you're just wanting more, but then it's like building up inside of you where like you constantly feel like you're not doing anything, and it kind of like becomes a hindrance to you, or like a feeling of dread.
Oh, can you explain what you mean by dread?
Yeah, I have this quite often where it's like I do a lot of like streaming, but if I don't stream or like do anything for the day, I feel a lot of dread in terms of like I feel like I'm not doing enough in terms of like what my potential could be. So that I guess in and of itself could like, be a detriment to how you feel in terms of like how happy you are in life or how content you are in life. So even if I don't make a decision, that could negatively impact how I feel, right? So going from like a 0 to like a -3 for that day or something. I don't know.
I see. I mean, I feel like inaction naturally lowers the general quality of your life because at a certain point, any sort of short term situations that you're in will end up ending.
Mhm.
I know a lot of people have reported that, let's say during COVID, for example, when they felt like they had way more free time than they knew what to do with. And a lot of them ended up basically in this cycle of inaction. A lot of them, I think, felt less fulfilled generally in their lives. I feel like that seems somewhat similar here.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Earlier, when you mentioned taking risks in the context of improving, and you said that when you are just looking to improve, then you basically are allowed to take more risks because you sort of inherently have less on the line. Do you feel like there's a way to foster that mentality? I hear it sometimes referred to as beginner's mindset, where you sort of expect failure as the default result of any action that you try to take. Do you feel like there's merit in being able to foster that mentality even as you improve?
Mm. I definitely believe so. Like always thinking, uh, I guess there's a couple of parts that I want to talk about with this topic is that like I've seen a lot of the times with OSU players as well, or even League of Legends players, because those are the two spaces that I'm like pretty familiar with. Is that when I've asked people like, why don't you do this? It's because the first initial reaction is just like, oh, I just can't do it, right? And it's
Oh,
because a lot of the times like these higher levels of players have improved at what they did, and then when they try to go back and improve a skill that they need to improve on, but they're afraid of looking bad, I guess, in front of people or like to themselves. They just don't want to do it because they don't have that like you said, the beginner's mindset of like the default of failure, where they think that they've improved to the point where it's like they are a good player and they don't want to take the time, even if they look ridiculous or bad at what they do, to improve at a specific thing that they need to, right? So, for example, on Osu, there's a lot of times where I ask people like, "Oh, do you play like hidden hard rock or like these specific mods?" And they say, "Oh no, I just can't read hidden," or like, "I can't do hard rock," right? And it's like, "But like, do you practice it?" And they're like, "No, I just don't do it." So you know what I mean?
right.
So being open to like failure is like a very important thing. And like the mindset of like always learning. You hear this all the time. It's like the master will always something learn keep learning or something along those lines,
Oh,
right? And I think that's really important to have a mindset as.
I like how you mentioned with OSU players where, or really anything, but a lot of the times it seems like people improve enough to where they have a concept of themselves as being a good player.
Mm-hmm.
And then that I think ties into the whole identity thing that we were talking about before, where you now identify as being a good player and good players don't get bad scores. And so,
Good players don't suck, man.
yeah. How do you feel like this belief that you shouldn't be performing poorly after you reach a certain point? How much of that do you feel like relates to ego?
Oh, I think that's like probably 90%. It's ego and like how you want to appear to other people, I feel like.
How would you define ego necessarily?
I guess ego would be like your thought of like where you think you are skill level wise based on like other people or like what your status is based on other people.
Oh, interesting. So it's definitely relative to other people.
Yeah, for sure.
I see.
Because if you have no one else to compare it to, it's like it's not ego, it's just like a self-reflection kind of thing.
Right. I can see the argument where ego is actually exactly what we were talking about, where you have an identity of yourself as being good at something, or maybe even your identity of yourself is you see yourself as better than you really are, and you try to act in accordance with that identity of yourself.
And I think it definitely has to do with more of like thinking you're better, right? Rather than the opposite of like I'm worse than people, because that's not really ego, right? It's more of like
Right.
I am better compared to these people kind of thing.
I see.
So it's like self-esteem without the lower part.
What is the lower part?
Of like because with ego, you can't really ego if you're the worst player. Or I guess technically you can believe that you're the worst player, right? But
Right.
in terms of self-esteem, like you can have bad self-esteem, but with ego, I feel like it's more ties into like you can only see yourself in like a better light than other people.
Okay, I see.
I guess in the term in the sense of like I guess you could have like fragile ego, but
Right.
more so in the sense of like how you look to other people, right? I mean, does that tie it into self-esteem? I feel like it's more of like a bragging thing when you talk about ego.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. What lessons can we take away from the league in the context of leadership and delegation?
Hmm. From league, that's a hard one. In terms of like league, like you kind of have to treat everyone as like a little kid, right? You're basically playing Kindergartner Simulator 2022, or whatever year you play, right? And you just have to assume baseline that everyone's like baby raging,
I
right?
see.
The thing that I've learned from League is like, I guess if any good has come out of League, where if you engage with these kinds of players in a sense of like discussion or like argument, I guess it's not even discussion, it's just argument. If you stoop down to these people's levels, you hear it all the time. It's like you are not be the bigger person and like don't engage with this kind of behavior. It's entirely true in League, and it's even worse than in person because these people are like anonymous. So they think they can get away with stuff. So people will just say whatever they want to say. And what I realized from that point on was like, if I enjoy the game, keep playing the game. I do not have to interact with these people and just play the best that I can to keep improving. But being the bigger person is not it's not a sign of weakness. It's just for your own mental, right? So it helps you as a person to like grow, to be a better person and not stoop down to these people's levels. It really is. So it's like a test to, I guess, show how mature you are
Do you feel like muting all is worthwhile advice in the real world?
in the real world. Ooh. Actually, this actually ties into a pretty important thing. I don't think it depends on what you do, right? I want to go on to a smaller scale with League first.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And the reason for this is because it kind of ties into what I want to talk about later. On a smaller scale with League, the reason why you mute all is because people don't have anything constructive to talk about. A lot of the times, when they're like saying things, it's not any positive construct or like positive criticism. It's just to vent their frustrations, and you don't see people's viewpoints. It's just straight anger or frustration.
It's a reflection of their ego being shattered.
Exactly. And so because they can't handle their emotions, this is what you see. This is the product of all that. And so I personally think muting all is a little troll. I think muting chat is fine, but muting pings as well, like you can't see their intentions to the game. I think that's a little troll. So
I didn't actually know that muting all will also mute pings.
yeah, it mutes everything.
I see.
So pings, emotes are fine. Like you can mute emotes, that doesn't matter. But pings, you get rid of people's intentions, and I think that's the important part. Now, however, if people are just spam pinging you, like spam pinging that you're alive, right? Then that's obviously not helpful. And then at that point, you can mute the individual player. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this first is because in a broader sense in life, where muting all is there's a positive and a negative side where you should be listening to different types of viewpoints in life because if you don't you're in a bubble and that's when you foster a very hateful society and a very hateful like I guess group.
I'm not
um
sure if I would describe it as hateful necessarily, but
oh sorry,
maybe
close-minded.
right. Delusional is
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
right. At least that's how I understand it.
yeah, more delusional and like less inclined to take criticism from other people.
Right.
Right. Sorry, I was thinking in the sense of like people that don't listen, like those hate groups and things like
I
that.
see. I
But
see.
but I what I meant was exactly yeah, like they're more delusional and don't take criticism or advice. Well, what is that called exactly? The like it is a bubble, but like the echo chamber,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's an echo chamber. So in life, I don't think muting all is healthy because you need to see the viewpoints of a lot of different people. And you need to then after hearing those things that are like from their side of their viewpoint, then you can form your own conclusion kind of thing.
You mentioned in League that being able to see other people's pings or intent is important.
Hmm.
I think that was one of the initial thoughts that came to mind when I was asking the question of like lessons that you can take away from League in the context of leadership and delegation,
Hmm.
where you can, for example, in League, you can be split pushing. You can be on another side of the game map and ping your team to do something on the other side of the map and sort of
Hmm.
have coordination in that sense. Do you feel like everyone on a team has equal say in decision making? Or do you feel like decision making should be sort of centralized, but more like understood through the context of how it works in League?
Yeah. I think that that kind of thing or like that kind of system really just depends on like how you function as a team. I guess you can like I guess starting as a just a general idea, you should have a leadership position where they're delegating a lot of the commands and things that's going to happen, things that are going to happen. They should have a big say on like how to coordinate the team, but having everyone's input is very important, I would say, as long as they're comfortable with, putting out their thoughts out there like that. Because there's some people out in this world that are just good at listening, rather than giving their opinions on certain subjects.
Right.
There's a lot of different kinds of people in this world. So, kind of understanding how they function in a team environment is really important. So, sometimes, like in a team environment, like maybe you don't even have a captain, right? You don't even have a leader where everyone is just kind of like delegated kind of equal power to say what they want to say. There are teams that work really well with one person in charge and four people that are just listening, people that are good at just understanding instructions and carrying them out. I think it really just depends on the people you have in your team.
How can you resolve internal conflict between a team when two people on the team both feel like they are the one person that everyone else should listen to? Because I feel like that is a situation that appears in League somewhat often.
Yeah. If you're talking about it in a solo queue sense, it's like, you just kind of go on to the next game or like drop your ego if
Oh.
you want to win, right? You drop your ego, and just try to work it out. And the goal of League of Legends is to win the game. It's not to fight against your teammates, right? That's absolutely ridiculous. So the goal of League of Legends is you are queuing up to destroy the enemy nexus. It is not to fight against your teammates. It's not to blame your team, which happens almost every single game, which is like people just don't know how to control their emotions. And so if you want to win your game of League of Legends, you just drop your ego if you're the one that wants to be shot calling, despite how bad the other person is, right? If your goal is to win, do everything possible to win the game, right? So whatever means possible. And so if you're talking about in a team sense of like you're stuck with a team and like two people are wanting to shot call, just be honest with each other, right? Being honest and like open communication is the most important thing, even if like you feel like it's wrong. Even if everything goes terrible, like if you guys are honest with each other, like you can be like, okay, I said everything that I wanted to said. What do we do from this point?
Right.
Kind of like a relationship where like if you hold things back and like you try to like make puzzles and clues for the other person to like pick up on, it's like just be open about it. Just like tell them what you're feeling, tell them what you want to do, and then from that point on resolve it, whether it's team disbanding or a team becoming stronger, right? Just figure it out from that point on.
Right.
But in solo queue, yeah, you just kind of go next if they're being like a great team player.
Do you feel like the concept of go next has any application in real life?
Go next is like, I guess you can apply it to different things, as in like your day was shitty. It's a single day in your life. Just go next, right? Maybe tomorrow will be a better day, right? Maybe the next game will be better game. It doesn't always just end like there. So if you want to keep pushing forward and like let's say for the day itself, bad day, just go next. That's it. It was a shitty day, accept it, go to the next day, right?
I feel like the lesson that's really taken from saying go next is really about not dwelling on situations that were a bit unfortunate, for lack of a better term.
Exactly. And it's like sometimes things aren't in your control. And so accept it. Don't dwell on the fact that it was a terrible day. And you just keep moving on and just moving on to the next day, I guess, or whatever you want to apply it to. I guess like maybe this job wasn't the right fit for you. So you just want to move on to the next one. Going next is like a mentality of like with things that aren't there are things that are on the line when you like have a job and things like that or like a relationship, but when it's like something like not as impactful, then I guess you could apply like go next.
I feel like this actually somewhat relates to what's called the sunk cost fallacy, where
Mm,
basically the more you've invested into something, the more you try to salvage it, even if it's not going to result in anything fruitful.
yeah.
I feel like this sort of mentality of go next sort of, in some senses, it gives you permission to move on to something that is a bit more fruitful. And as I mentioned, not dwelling on situations that happened in the past.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's like the biggest takeaway from like saying go next or like understanding that is like accept what you are feeling and like see what you can do in the future.
Right, right.
So having the feeling of acceptance for the situation is like, I think that's really important.
Oh, I like the way you put that. I think it sort of aligns your mentality to assess things a bit more objectively. It sort of takes away a lot of the pressure to keep things the way they are necessarily.
Mhm. Yeah, because personally, like me as a person as well, is like I had a very difficult time when I was growing up to like accept my feelings and moving on from that point on. Because a lot of the times, like I would treat it one of two ways, where like I would dwell on the fact and be very angry, or just not deal with it at all and have the same problems reoccur and not have it solved. So when me and my girlfriend have been talking like recently with our relationship and things like that, and trying to figure out what we can do to like move on from this point, it's always like accepting what has happened, understanding what it was, and then just moving on from that point on. Because like if you just kind of like glaze over it and be like, okay, whatever, the next day, and you didn't talk about it or anything, like the same situation will occur. Same thing with solo queue. The same situation will occur, and you'll deal with it the same way. Same like result will happen, and you won't know how to deal with it. And it's gonna just keep occurring like a cycle.
When you mention that aspect of League, do you sort of mean in the sense of not allowing yourself to reflect on the mistakes that you may have made and learn from them?
Yeah. So let's say it could be like the mistakes that you made in the game. A lot of the times people just blame other people for things that they could have controlled in the game. So one thing that I do like to tell people when they say, how do I climb when my jungler is feeding every game? I always tell them like, if Faker was in your shoes, right? If you guys don't know who Faker is, he's like the goated player of all time in League of Legends. If Faker was in your shoes, do you think he would have not been able to play better than you did? Right? And then they're like, well, but my jungler feeds every game. And it's like, that's not the point. The point is that you are in your game every single game. So what's the most constant factor in that situation? It's yourself. So what do you got to do? Even if your jungler is inting quote unquote every game, which is not happening, right? It's not every single game your jungler is inting. Sometimes you int. You just got to improve yourself so that for the next situation that appears, or the next time the same situation appears that you have a feeding jungler, you know how to deal with these situations a little bit better and understand how to play in every situation.
I remember hearing once that like in League, you're not only playing your character, you're also playing everyone else through pings and communication. And I think, first of all, I definitely agree with what you said, where there's a lot of responsibility that should also be put on yourself whenever something goes wrong, especially just in the context of feeling like your jungler is not, is not doing their best. I feel like you also have a responsibility to communicate what you want them to do for you and give them the opportunities to make use of their potential, basically, and help the team win. And it's sort of a team effort to allow those situations to manifest or appear, basically.
Yeah, I 100% agree with this because when I climbed for my rank 1 climb in season 12, I was the first person to hit rank 1 or like challenger in season 12. And during that time, it's like I didn't play so insanely well. Like I didn't play like Faker, right? The way I played was around my teammates. And even if they made a mistake, I would use that mistake to my advantage and see what I can salvage out of that situation to make it the best possible play, right? So even if your jungler is inting, even if your support is inting, there are always plays you can make to salvage that situation to make it a better than what it should be, right? And that's where you come in as like the constant to make those situations like your win rate, like you make your win rate go up because of you. And so the way I did it when I did the climb was I would just always play off of enemy mistakes and my team mistakes, right? And if my team played well, then I would play off how well they played and things like that.
I feel like there's a lot to do with adaptability. If you had a plan in mind and then your teammate maybe makes a mistake that makes your plan not reasonable anymore, there is a really important sense of adaptability to reconstruct your plan based on the new current situation instead of still trying to commit to a plan that in your mind should have worked if not for X person's mistake. It then becomes, since this is now the new situation, what is the new best plan of action? And there's this quote, I think it's like, plans are useless, but planning is essential. Where
yes,
the plan itself doesn't really do you any good, but it is very important to go through the process of planning so you have an idea of what to expect based on the current information that you have.
So how do you you view League of Legends like when you play? Like, do you have a plan in mind when you play, or how do you see the game as like when you play?
I'll sort of relate this to the concept of plans being useless, but planning being essential. I like to use this sort of example as well, where when you are first setting out on a journey or adventure or path, whatever it may be, the plan that you make before you started along that path is the plan that you made when you were least informed about that situation and how it will go. And so if you try to stick to that plan, even as you grow more and gain more experience, I feel like it's very limiting. The context I usually describe this in is when people ask about, in the context of OSU, tablet area or mouse sensitivity or any other game settings that you might use. Whatever tablet area you chose when you started basically is the area that you chose when you were least informed on or least experienced. And so feeling like you have to stay committed to that area just because it was what you chose at the beginning. Obviously, there's merit in terms of that being the area that you're most used to so far. But I mean, obviously, that's going to be the case regardless of what you ended up choosing. So I think allowing yourself the freedom to adapt your plans as you gain more information about a situation is really, really important.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I think that's the true way of like playing successfully in League of Legends. It's kind of the same thing that you're talking about, where you got to adapt based on what information you have, right? And the way I see it is everything is a flowchart. You have a flowchart from the beginning where you have champions, you have runes, you have what is early game strategy that people are going to most likely use. And then from that point on, you flowchart all the way down and to the side. And you have a bunch of these flowcharts as you play the game. as you gain more, experience or as you gain more information. And you choose based on how the game is going. You choose the optimal flowchart based on what's going on. And you have to keep adapting to like these flowcharts. Because a lot of the times people just have a single flowchart and they're like, I'm going to do this, right? But you need to have multiple of those and
Right.
play optimally based off of that. So that's how I see League of Legends is like, I have like at least 3 choices that I'm going to do minimum if this play doesn't work out.
I feel like the game that most utilizes that sort of system of thinking, or like that really pushes you to be able to do that very well, is actually Teamfight Tactics. The sort of adaptability of your plan given a new situation, because there's a lot of random elements. I won't go too far into that, but just sort of something that came to mind. But yeah, I think having a very flexible decision matrix, for lack of a better term, and especially being able to know what sorts of information is actually useful in the first place. I think that's also something that is a little underrated as far as, the thing of like not knowing what you don't know.
Yes.
So
I think that is pretty funny. Like, if you don't mind me
yeah.
interjecting. I think it's pretty funny that you bring up team fight tactics because I always compare TFT to League, and I always say the same thing where it's like TFT is just a flowchart game without the mechanics, right? It's
Right.
literally League of Legends without the mechanics,
Right.
right? So that's what it just feels like in terms of like flowcharting. I guess you could apply it to a bunch of different games, but it's funny that you mentioned TFT because I say the exact same thing about the game.
Oh, that's interesting. I remember recently trying to like conceptualize how you would describe TFT to someone who doesn't know what it is. And obviously people naturally relate it to League. I think I would usually think of it as like League if it was only the macro aspect of the game. But I think really emphasizing the whole decision making or like flowchart concepts is actually a much better way to think about it. So aside from what we've talked about already, what do you think non-League players could take away from some of the concepts that you learn from improving at League?
Non-League players could take away from. So for me, I guess that if you don't play League of Legends, the biggest like I guess analogy that I could give you is I play mid lane.
Can you sort of explain what exactly mid lane means? Because literally what mid lane means is that you are usually around the middle of the game map as opposed to being on one of the far sides of it, is what you're saying? Okay. Right. So you have a lot faster access to everywhere else on the map, basically.
Exactly. You have more options. So as a mid laner, you have a bunch of different options in terms of like you can go top lane to gank, you can go bot lane to gank, you can go into people's jungles, you can get vision. There's so many different options that you have as a mid laner. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because there are these things called roam timers. And when you have a roam timer, this opens up a couple of different opportunities for you to make. Now, in League of Legends, there is no correct answer. There's only good and bad answers, right? And they could work out and they can't work out. And in the same way in life, where you have all these options in life, and it could be a good answer, it could be a bad answer, but you can only gain that through experience and playing the game, which is life, right? So the reason why I bring this up is because kind of like roaming, it essentially ties into like how you should live your life in the sense of like keep a lot of your options open because this will help you determine what kind of decision to make in terms of like, is this a good decision? Is this a bad decision? And so if you keep your options open like this, you have a lot better chance of succeeding and winning the game. And, if you were to tie this into life, you have a lot better chance of winning at life or becoming successful at life if you keep your options open and see what different kinds of things that you can do to approach these kinds of scenarios, right? Don't always just think like, I'm going to do this, like be narrow-minded and only have a single plan. Keep your options open because you never know with new information, what kind of plays will work out for you.
Have you ever played the Wikipedia game?
I have not, but I've seen it.
It's basically where you start on one Wikipedia page and then you have another end goal Wikipedia page that you want to reach, and you have to reach it only by clicking on hyperlinks within the page that you're on. So like you can't go search anything, and you sort of have to use whatever is at your disposal to like create your own path towards a certain predetermined end goal, basically, is how the game works.
Yeah.
I always like using this analogy of the Wikipedia game when the concept of keeping your options open basically is brought up, just because I feel like the Wikipedia game actually does the best job of like illustrating that concept, where you don't actually know what your end path is going to look like, and there's realistically no way for you to, you could conceptualize like a theoretical path that you could take to get from your current page to the one that you're trying to get to,
Yeah.
but in reality you have to adapt to whatever you end up seeing on your page. And there's a lot of, I guess, like simple strategy where like it's not actually worth your time to assess every single hyperlink that's on the page and like try to predict what the absolute best option would be. In the sense that if you just continue taking actions that are good enough or generally are putting you in the right direction, I think continuously taking action will give you much greater chances of success. It's sort of similar to allowing yourself to roll the dice over and over again.
I see.
Where even if you end up rolling lower generally than someone who tries to hyper optimize each dice roll, you will end up accumulating more points by the end of a certain amount of time compared to someone else. And you also can't really truly predict exactly what links are going to be on a different page. You could have a pretty good idea, right? But yeah, I think that's just sort of the concept that first came to mind when you mentioned that.
I think that's a really good example, actually, because like you can't go back on the page either, right?
That's right.
Like just in life, once you make the decision, you can't rewind time. You've made the decision.
Right. One of the rules in the Wikipedia game is you're not allowed to use the back button on your browser. So once you choose a hyperlink to click on to try getting closer to the goal page, you're not allowed to undo that decision. You have to then make do with whatever options are available to you now on your current page.
I think that's a really good analogy, actually, compared to life. 10 out of 10.
Thank you. That was one of the analogies that I think first inspired me to do this podcast series, because I sort of started to realize how many concepts you could take from games and apply them as like sort of life philosophies, or like allow yourself to understand life, I guess, a little better. As a sort of, if I can go meta for a little bit, that's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to do a podcast sort of like based around this topic of applying game concepts to real life, just because I feel like it's such an untapped concept, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think everyone has so many different things that they've experienced that like you can apply so many things that they've learned in this field, right, to life as well.
Right. Have you heard the idea that like there's no such thing as disciplines, only concepts?
No such thing as disciplines, only concept?
As in categories of knowledge, like you could say biology or calculus or philosophy, or economics, right? Where we categorize concepts into separate disciplines so that they're a little easier for us to understand. But I think in doing so, you end up cutting off certain connections that you could make between different concepts, because you're like categorizing them in different buckets that in the human mind are like less intuitive to connect with one another. But it could be the case that diminishing returns, for example, which is usually considered an economics concept, I think. I think that's a good example that I think also can apply to like general decision making. Things like exponential rates. That seems like a simple concept, but I think like there's definitely more complex examples of where certain concepts can be applied, or categorizing concepts only within the context of like different disciplines or whatever discipline you learned it in is very limiting in terms of coming up with new ideas, things like that. So yeah, I think sort of trying to create a environment where we deliberately try to take certain concepts out of their original context and applying them in more broader senses.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting thing, because I was actually talking about this with someone the other day. And like, let's take, for example, like a master in their craft, whatever it may be. Like, let's say for sewing, for example,
Okay.
right? They've learned so many concepts in that kind of like field, but like what they've learned can be applied to so many different aspects of life, right? But people don't see it that way. People just see it as like, oh, they just sew and they're really good at it. Cool.
Right.
Right. Same thing with like video games, where people are like, oh, cool, this kid's really good at video games. But it's like, have you thought about what kind of concepts they've learned throughout their experiences that could actually help or benefit in different parts of like whatever you're trying to improve at or life in general?
And it's not only the literal concepts that they learn from that activity, but also sort of the meta skills in terms of like patience, for example, or as you mentioned, learning how to improve in the first place is something that's very, very much more transferable than people think at first glance. But at the same time, I'm sure everyone can think of examples of people where they seem to be able to get really good at whatever they touch. And it's sort of because they've developed this sort of meta skill of learning how to improve at things
Mm,
that
yeah.
I think having gotten good at one activity to like a really deep level obviously teaches you that one skill, but more importantly, teaches you what going through the improvement process feels like and looks like. And I think that is very, very invaluable.
Yeah, this is why you'll see like a lot of like top players for video games. If they switch to a different game, you'll see them excel really quickly. Um, not all the time.
Right. If they're committed to it. Right.
Yeah, yeah, if they're committed to it. A lot of the times, like they'll use what they've learned previously to kind of like give them shortcuts to help improve at the new game that they're playing, which is like what I did with like I was really good at League. So
Right.
then I took those things that I've learned in League, improvement wise, to improve at Osu.
Right.
Right. But
Right.
I did have a little bit of musical background, so that like kind of helped as well. A lot of the like the hard work discipline kind of things, like being committed to like practicing those reading maps or like
Right.
reading like hidden, just trying a bunch of different new things and like sticking to it is like pretty important.
I don't know if you've ever tried teaching League to someone, for example, and or maybe teaching something else to someone. And when you're trying to explain a certain concept, you basically say like, "Oh, it's just like X in League," and they're like, "Oh, wow, you're right. That makes perfect sense." And it just instantly clicks for them, even though League is completely unrelated to whatever you're teaching,
Yeah.
or that sort of thing. Obviously, you can apply it to anything basically, but that sort of ability to take concepts from completely unrelated disciplines and apply them in such a way where the other person understands perfectly the new concept. I think if you're able to like make the concept in your mind more like flexible and freeformed, people who make analogies very easily or like think in analogies very often, I think naturally are very good at this. But yeah, just like I think a lot of people don't realize how many concepts they already understand, and more importantly, how many concepts they end up relearning because they don't relate it to something that they already understood before,
Hmm. I see.
which I think you could learn a lot faster if you're able to get past that sort of feeling, basically, or like limitation of conceptualizing things.
So one thing that I would like to ask, do you think we're bottlenecking I like improving as a society because we are kind of limiting how we think about concepts? I guess that's like a very broad question.
I think what this question really is asking is like, how has the schooling system failed us as a society?
True. Actually though, I actually dropped out of high school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to go pro in League.
Oh,
It didn't work out obviously. I'm a content creator. I just stream.
right.
But yeah, I think that's a really very important thing that like I guess I didn't even realize until now is like concepts that you learn in life, how can they be applied to different things that you're learning currently?
Right.
I'll have to think about that more for sure.
Yeah, I think just adopting that mindset is so powerful, I guess. So yeah, I think that's sort of one of the main motivations for being able to interview people and like sort of pick their brains about different concepts that they've learned from getting really good at things.
Hmm. That's a really cool thing to like I guess study. Is that like a is there like a field for that or is it just concepts?
Not really. It's sort of just a school of thought or like way of thinking because at the end of the day,
Mm,
you still obviously learn concepts within certain contexts. It doesn't make sense to just pick up a book of like here's a bunch of concepts, right? Because it's obviously much harder to learn if you don't have a certain context to apply something to.
yeah. You kind of need like a reference point in your life like to
Right.
make sense. Something that clicked with you before.
Yeah, exactly. And as a small side note, I don't know if you've heard people say that like, oh, why don't we teach kids financial literacy and how to do their taxes when they're in middle school and early high school? I'm not sure if you've heard that sort of argument when it comes to school,
Yeah,
but
I've heard that a lot.
at least from my perspective, I don't think that really makes sense. First of all, even in the classes that the student might find interesting, they often are not paying attention regardless. So what is going to happen when they are forced to take a class about financial literacy when they are 12, 13 years old? So obviously you're exposing them to the concepts in some sense, you could argue, but it seems like it would be a much more efficient use of their time if they learn those things when the time actually comes for it to be useful and for it to be applied, which is obviously what people end up doing anyway. But
Yeah. It's like they just look back in hindsight and be like, it would have been nice if I knew this. It's like, well, you
right.
probably wouldn't have because you wouldn't have found it interesting. So,
I think the one sort of class that, if there was one class that I think really should exist in schools, is probably culinary, something more to do with food, not really food science, but at least oh shoot, I almost want to say nutrition, but like just before I said it, I sort of realized how controversial that could be.
that's true.
So okay, maybe less in the sense of learning about nutrition necessarily, but at least culinary in the form of basic kitchen safety and like cooking in school.
I did take a culinary class back in middle school. I don't know if you guys had one.
We had one, but it obviously wasn't mandatory. I think it was like just one random elective.
Gotcha. Was it called home economics?
Oh no, it wasn't. That's a very interesting interesting name.
That's what our class was called.
Ours was just called culinary.
Oh, yeah, we would learn how to like cook, do sewing, I guess table mannerisms. I think that's one of them.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was weird, but I learned how to make Rice Krispies.
Oh, yeah, the exciting thing is that like a class like that can be very hands-on, and that's really where learning happens basically. Or it's like a very natural environment for the students to feel more engaged. Or I don't know, I might be talking out of thin air as well, but that's sort of how I see it, at least. So because after you make the food, you can have your cake and eat it too, basically. In one of your recent live streams, you mentioned that the worst players type the most.
I would say it is very common that a lot of people that are frustrated with their performance or with the performance of others are opinionated.
Do you feel like this is a concept that applies outside of League as well, where the worst players type the most, the least experienced end up talking the most, or the least skilled talk the most?
A lot of the times I like say it as like a personal thing to like that person at the time, where like if they're typing, I'm just like, oh yeah, the worst player types the most. Right. But for the most part, I would say it's the people that are the most emotionally constipated, right? The people that don't know how to control themselves are the ones that like have the most to say.
Interesting wording. I would have thought you would say emotionally reactive. I never heard that phrase before.
Yeah. So I think it just depends on the person. It doesn't really have to like, because like there's people that are bad at video games that just don't type, right? They just play for fun.
Right.
But yeah, I just at the time I said the worst player because like that person was typing a lot. Just kind of like a little jab at them.
Right.
Yeah, the way I see it is just the people that don't know how to express themselves coherently, or the people that are like passionate for the wrong reasons, or like passionate in a different sense. What would you call that? Like
they end up talking in circles around their actual point.
I think so. Yeah, the people that just like say things to just say things.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to respond without seeming like I'm saying things just to say things.
Dude, I'm like, I don't know if I'm saying the same things, but like I just say whatever. I'm comfortable. Like I don't really mind if I said the same thing like 10 times. It's whatever.
Right.
The way other people see me, I'm just like, I'm just gonna be myself. It's whatever. Like I've come to the point where it's like, it's very like cliche, where like don't care about what other people think about you. It's like it's so hard not to, but like just don't. Boom, easy dub. Like
I think the way that I sort of like to understand that is that people are always going to have a reason to dislike you. So you might as well be your truest self rather than be someone who you feel like others would not dislike as much, because it sort of is a constant rule of life, especially if you want to be someone who's somewhat in the spotlight. The more in the spotlight you are, the more aggressive people will be to you, whether because they actually disagree with some things you do or just because they have nothing better to do with their time. But regardless, people are always going to find reasons to dislike you. So if people are going to dislike you no matter what, then you might as well be your truest self.
Yeah. For that, I think there's like two parts to it. Whereas like when you get more into the spotlight, you'll have more people that are opinionated about what you do. And the first part of it is people will dislike you for what you do, no matter what it is. So just be yourself. The second part to that is when you do start doing stuff that's is your true self, there are some situations where people will just like give you a lot more pushback. Like for example, you do you know a Greek god?
Yes.
Yeah. So have you seen the things that he's been doing recently?
That I have not.
So he's been doing a lot of like very controversial things, speaking out about like how women should be acting or very like rude mannerisms, I guess, like
Okay.
mocking Asian people with like the way they sound, like the classic like ching chong, whatever, blah blah blah.
Okay.
And so like I guess you can say in a sense like he's being more himself, but like I think that's the thing that people are scared of is like the more you become yourself, you have to be aware that like of what people will think about you. And even if you are being true to yourself, it's like the bottom line is like, are you happy?
Right. Or I think more importantly, you have to be able to take ownership of your shortcomings in your character and actively work on those as well. Because in some sense, you have to be able to do what you're most passionate about without feeling like other people's criticisms will prevent you. But at
Hmm.
the same time, you can't be so blindsided to other people's criticisms that you never take them as an opportunity to improve yourself. Because
Yeah.
even if people don't verbalize their criticisms in the best way, they still came from somewhere. And if you're able to look past the toxicity of someone's words and still sort of find constructive criticism in the things people are saying and really take them to heart, not the toxicity part of the message, but
Hmm.
being able to adapt your character and grow based on what people tell you. I think being in the spotlight is very double edged because everyone will have an opinion of you, but also everyone has the opportunity to help you grow.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing is like you shouldn't really like care about how people's words should form how you act, but just be aware that when you do be in the spotlight like this, it's like you will have criticisms and there are things you do have to realize that like there are some things that are not acceptable. And even if that's like your true self, like you have to be at a good balance, right? You got to understand like there's things you can and cannot do in society.
Right.
That just goes along the lines of like that's a societal thing. That's a whole different topic, and like,
Yeah. It's like, I almost want to say some people don't even want to fit into society. Um, as long as you're not causing harm to other people, I think that's really where you have more freedom to act however you'd like or however makes you happy.
yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is like if you're not harming people,
Right.
I think that's the one of the most important things.
I think actually more importantly is being able to recognize if what you're doing is actually harming other people, because I feel like the people who need to hear that the most would never really realize. And that relates to what you mentioned about being in an echo chamber or sort of being in your own bubble of not recognizing other people's criticisms of your actions, behavior, character, whatever it might be.
Hmm.
So, yes, very, very well said. Is there any advice that you have for beginners in general, or be it in League or in OSU or any other activity you've done, or even just general advice for beginners that could apply regardless of the activity?
Ooh, this is a good one because this applies to basically everything in life. Is you want to do things with intention. Intention is like one of the most important things because whether it be you just want to have fun with the game or you want to get good at the game, being able to identify what you're doing, the task that you're doing, like the reason why you're doing it is really important. A lot of people, when they ask me, like, hey, I'd like to have some advice for streaming, like, how do I stream? Like, can I get some advice? And I say the biggest thing you want to do is identify why you're doing it in the first place. Some people will say, like, I want to do it for money. And it's like some people will say, I wanted to do to foster a community. Right. So, but being able to identify why you're doing it will help you either have fun with what you do, if that's the goal, or deliberately create the life that you want to create, right? So
Right.
instead of just being like wishy-washy and just like I said before, like just going with the flow, you'll be able to create more opportunity for yourself if you know what you're looking for in the first place.
I think it also sort of starting with why, basically, it will help you recognize if that activity will actually help you reach your goals in the first place. Because let's say you want to start live streaming and your main motivation is because you want to make money. Um, sorry to break it to you, but there are much easier ways to make money than making content.
Agreed.
So I think really being able to look at the situation and like some people understand that and they still want to do it through that method, in which case surely there's some other primary motivation or like fulfillment that they would get out of live streaming, for example. But I think really being able to be honest with yourself with why you're doing what you're doing. First of all, it will keep you motivated through tougher times. Whenever you stick with something through the long term, there's always going to be periods where you're not seeing as much growth or you're not seeing as much improvement as you did when you were a beginner. That is the nature of improvement. In language learning, there's a concept called the intermediate plateau, where the concept is basically that when you're a beginner, the amount, like the percent increase in your abilities is way beyond 100. Let's say if you're learning a language, you go from knowing 0 words to 2 words. That is an infinite increase in your understanding of that language.
That's true.
And the more you improve, the increase from 10 to 20 and the increase from 110 to 120 is both 10. But the further along you are, the less of an increase you feel from the same amount of gain. And
yeah.
If I think the bottom line that I'm trying to say is that if your motivation stems from seeing growth, then you will never reach the point of being at the top of anything that you do, because you will reach a point of stagnation in the amount that you're feeling like you're improving, or you'll even have some times where you feel like you're getting worse or doing worse before you ever reach the top. I think that I don't really like to make statements in absolutes, but I'm pretty confident with that one. So with that in mind, you need a very strong foundation of reasons why you're doing something to get you through those times where you can't, like motivation won't be there to carry you.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. A lot of the times as well, like motivation shouldn't be the only thing that's keeping you going, right? A lot of the times you need consistency, discipline, right?
Right.
And yeah, having that very core belief or like reason why you're doing it is also very important. That should help you and motivate you as well, but it shouldn't be the only factor.
Right.
That's the thing too with content creation. It's like content creating is like it doesn't give you exact results because there are streamers out there with like 10,000 views that are worse streams, objectively worse streams than people that are at like 10 views,
Right.
right? Or like people on YouTube that have like 100 views on a video that could have put in way more effort or way more better quality than someone that has like 100,000 views, right? And I guess one thing I would like to say for content creation is like you just want to stay consistent as possible so that it's like how should I say it? It's like you're putting in a like a ticket every time you post a video or every time you create content, mostly for YouTube, I would say, because YouTube or TikTok, I should say, for example, you're putting in a ticket into like a lottery ticket, a lottery pool. And each time you do that, you may see 0 results. But one day, if you're consistent enough, you'll hit that like jackpot and you'll just have the ball rolling from that point. I would say people that are like successful on these kinds of platforms, like creator platforms, YouTube, TikTok, they're not lucky, right? They worked consistently to get to the point where they were able to hit that jackpot and move on from that point, right? A lot of the times, people don't stream one time or one video and they just pop off and they just like become this huge content creator. A lot of the times, they spend countless hours to maybe have that one video pop off and then they move on from that point on. So it's all about being consistent if you're trying to do content creation.
Right. And I think in some sense I wouldn't really describe it as luck, but if it helps for some people to conceptualize it this way, it's sort of like you learn how to manipulate the odds of luck of being in your favor, whether that's through sheer volume or, maybe learning how the algorithm works, like studying what other successful creators do in maybe the first 10 seconds of their video and like sort of throughout, the pacing of your video and titles and thumbnails and all that sort of science, quote unquote, to
Hmm.
manipulating your odds because in theory, it's possible to be feeling like you're doing everything right and still not be able to get that lucky break, if you want to call it that.
That's
But
true. Yeah, yeah.
it's really more about doing something so much that you manipulate the odds of success to being in your favor. So in some sense, you could say that there's luck involved in that, and some arguments you could say that there isn't. But regardless, I think that's sort of a fair way to interpret it.
I think a lot of people can make it, right, if you do it consistently enough. But the thing is, like, there's so many factors in terms of like, was your content entertaining enough? Like, did you put enough quality into the video? Did you do everything correctly? Because a lot of the times, like these people that are at the top, if they did it again, they can make it again.
Right.
And a lot of the things that people don't realize is like streaming on Twitch every single day for 16 hours a day is not going to get you there, right? You have to realize like what they're doing right and what you're doing wrong.
Yeah, that's a dangerous fallacy to fall into is feeling like you can get discovered straight through Twitch.
That is the worst.
Yeah. But yeah, there's definitely content creators that are much more successful than I am who have made videos talking about sort of the principles that you should keep in mind. The two main ones that come to mind are Disguised Toast and Ludwig.
Ludwig for sure.
Yeah, they both made good videos on this topic. So if you guys are curious, you can look up Disguised Toast, how to start on YouTube or something like that. That's basically what the video is about. And Ludwig also, I think his is like, don't start on YouTube before watching this, or like don't start streaming before watching this, something like that. If you're interested in that topic.
I think one interesting thing that I would like to add on to this actually is I feel like there's four different things that you need to have, at least one of them, to become successful in content creation. And one of them being you have to be good looking, right? Attractive. That's one of the things. Two, you are extremely good at what you do. So being skilled in a game or skilled in whatever thing that you do. And then three is being extremely lucky, like just being one of those extremely lucky people. And then four being one of the more attractive type of person, someone that brings you in or like is very charismatic, I should say,
Right.
right? Whether that be like funny or like relatable. I think if you have one of those four things, right, luck being the hardest thing to obviously do, which it's not really in your,
Right. Not controllable.
yeah, it's not really controllable. If you have at least one of those three things, I feel like in content creation, you can definitely be successful if you have one of those three traits.
Right. And it's an or, right? Not an and.
Not an and. Yeah, so at least having one of those traits.
Right.
And with like, with like VTubing, like you can make very attractive models,
Right.
right? You
Right.
can make very charismatic character, right?
Right.
You can play this character. So there's a lot of different ways to like go about it nowadays. Skill is like one of the hardest things to do because you have to put a lot of time into it.
Right. But I think it's one of the most reliable, and also it's not something you can really fake necessarily. So I think it's a more genuine motivation for others to come watch your content.
Hmm.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was very enjoyable to like, talk about.
Yeah, thanks again for taking the time to do this. Very, very insightful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.